Today, pyramid schemes are everywhere. In finance, in fraud, even in failed companies. But what most people don't know is that one such model once helped Nazi Germany rearm itself at a time when the country was broke, under strict international restrictions and forbidden to build a military. In the 1930s, while the world watched cautiously, Germany was quietly preparing for war. It had no money, no legal path to fund rearmament, and no room for error. Yet somehow it built one of the most powerful armies in Europe, and did it in secret. How? Simply through a fake company, forged promises, and some very clever accounting. Welcome to the Nazi Ponzi scheme no one talks about. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. At that time, the country was still struggling to recover from the Great Depression. Unemployment was high, industries were operating below capacity, and many Germans had lost faith in the democratic government of the Weimar Republic. For Hitler and the Nazi Party, this crisis was not just a problem, it was an opportunity. The Nazi vision for Germany was bold and aggressive. Hitler wanted to restore national pride, rebuild the military, and expand German territory. One of the first goals was rearmament, the rapid growth of Germany's army, navy, and air force. Hitler believed that Germany had been betrayed from within and humiliated after World War I. Only through military strength could it become a great power again. This plan would require factories to produce tanks, planes, guns, and uniforms. It would also require training and paying hundreds of thousands of new soldiers. But there was a serious problem. Germany simply didn't have the money. After World War I, the Treaty of Versailles had imposed strict limits on Germany's armed forces. The army was reduced to 100,000 men. The navy was limited to a few old ships. The air force was completely banned. The treaty also placed limits on how much Germany could spend on weapons and military production. Any attempts to expand the armed forces would break international law and alert foreign governments. At the same time, Germany's economy was still weak. Although things had started to improve slightly by 1933, the company had not yet fully recovered from the economic collapse of the late 1920s. Industrial output was low, tax revenues were limited, and the government already owed large sums of money. Any serious plan to rebuild the military would require billions of Reichsmarks, money the government simply did not have. One option would have been to borrow the money through public loans. Governments often sell bonds to raise funds, promising to repay the money later with interest. But this method had its limits in Germany at the time. The Weimar Constitution placed legal restrictions on how much interest the government could offer, no more than 4.5%, which made these bonds less attractive to investors. Even worse, large-scale borrowing would have drawn attention. Foreign governments, especially Britain and France, were watching Germany closely for any sign that it was preparing for war. If Hitler openly borrowed large amounts of money, it might cause panic, both at home and abroad. There was also another concern: inflation. Just 10 years earlier, Germany had suffered one of the worst episodes of hyperinflation in modern history. In 1923, the value of the German mark collapsed. Prices rose so quickly that people needed wheelbarrows of cash just to buy a loaf of bread. Savings were wiped out. Wages became worthless. That crisis had shaken the country to its core, and memories of it were still fresh in people's minds. If the government started printing too much money again, it could trigger another round of inflation and destroy what little trust remained in the economy. Hitler knew that he needed to rearm Germany, but he couldn't risk economic collapse, international backlash, or public unrest. He needed a way to secretly fund his military build-up without drawing attention, breaking the law outright, or flooding the economy with cash. This is where Hjalmar Schacht enters the story. Schacht was a respected economist and banker. He had served as president of the Reichsbank, Germany's central bank during the Weimar era, and had helped stabilize the economy after the hyperinflation crisis of the 1920s. Though he was not a Nazi by ideology, Schacht supported Hitler's rise to power and believed that the Nazi regime could bring order and strength back to Germany. In 1933, he returned as head of the Reichsbank. The following year, Hitler appointed him Minister of Economics. Schacht understood both the dangers of inflation and the limits of legal borrowing, but he also knew how to work around the rules. He began looking for a way to fund Hitler's military plans, without causing alarm and without using traditional methods of government finance. What he came up with would become one of the most complex and deceptive financial schemes of the 20th century. It was a plan built on paper promises, hidden debts, and a fake company. and it worked, at least for a while. By 1934, Hitler's ambitions were clear. He wanted Germany to rearm quickly and secretly, but the country still lacked the money to do so without risking financial collapse or international backlash. Hjalmar Schacht, now serving as both President of the Reichsbank and Minister of Economics, was tasked with finding a solution. He knew that traditional methods of government borrowing and spending would not be enough, and might even be illegal. So he came up with a new idea: create a company that didn't really exist. That year, Schacht oversaw the creation of a new firm with a long and complicated name, Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft mit beschränkter Haftung, which means in English, the Metallurgical Research Corporation with limited liability. Fortunately, it went by a much shorter name, MEFO. On paper, this was a private business. Its name sounded technical and official, which helped disguise its real purpose. It was registered as a limited liability company under German law, just like any normal business. But unlike normal businesses, MEFO had no factory, no workers, and no offices. It didn't produce anything, didn't offer any service, it didn't even have a telephone number listed. It was what economists call a dummy company. A company that exists only on paper, with no actual operations. This was exactly what Schacht wanted. The company's job wasn't to build machines or research metals, despite what its name suggested. Its only purpose was to sit quietly on the books and act as a middleman between the German government and the country's growing arms industry. The beauty of the plan, from Schacht's point of view, was that since MEFO wasn't officially part of the government, it didn't have to follow the same rules. The public wouldn't see it, foreign governments wouldn't suspect it, and the law couldn't easily reach it. To make the company appear legitimate, Schacht arranged for 4 major German industrial giants to provide the starting funds. These companies were Krupp, Siemens, Rheinmetall, and Guthoffnungsschut. All of them were large, well-known firms that worked in steel, machinery, and military production. In total, they contributed 1 million Reichsmarks in share capital. This was not a large sum by itself, but it was enough to give the company a legal foundation. These companies had good reasons to cooperate. They stood to benefit greatly from the government contracts from weapons and military equipment. By helping to set up MEFO, they were helping the Nazis rearm Germany, and in return they expected more business, more profits, and more influence. They didn't need to know the full details of what Schacht was planning. They only needed to know that they would be closer to the center of power. Although MEFO was registered as a private company, it was never truly independent. The government made sure it stayed under tight control. The board of directors included 2 key figures, one chosen by the Reich Ministry of Defense and one chosen by the Reichsbank. These men reported directly to Nazi officials and made sure that the company did exactly what the state wanted. In this way, it remained private on paper, but in reality, it was run by the government behind the scenes. This arrangement allowed Schacht to build a financial tool that could operate in secret. It had the appearance of a normal business and followed the rules of private commerce, but every part of it was controlled by the Nazi regime. The company gave the government a mask, one that it could hide behind while carrying out a massive build-up of arms without admitting the cost. The dummy company was now in place. It looked harmless, it sounded technical, and it attracted no public attention. But what it would go on to do would quietly reshape Germany's economy, hide billions in military spending, and delay the financial collapse that was already on the horizon. Once MEFO was officially created, Schacht would begin to put his real plan into action. This fake company would now start issuing a new kind of financial instrument, MEFO bills. These were not government bonds, and they were not printed money either. They were bills of exchange. In simple terms, they were promises to pay later. Each bill had a 6-month maturity date and offered an interest rate of 4% per year, which was higher than most ordinary short-term investments at the time. On the surface, this seemed like a straightforward business deal. The government, working secretly through the company, would order weapons from private arms manufacturers. These manufacturers would then build tanks, artillery, warplanes, ships, and other military equipment. But instead of being paid in regular currency, they received bills as payment. These were essentially IOUs, legal documents saying that MEFO promised to pay them the full amount plus interest in 6 months. I mean, imagine selling real weapons, machines of war, and getting paid in monopoly money with a wink from the government. Would you accept it? At first glance, this may sound like a bad deal, but there were reasons why arms companies were willing to accept these unusual payments. First, the 4% interest rate made the bills more attractive than regular trade credit or low-interest government bonds. These bills were backed by MEFO, which appeared to be a private business, but everyone knew that they were also guaranteed by the Reichsbank, Germany's central bank. This made them feel safe. If the company didn't pay, the Reichsbank would. The bills also came with flexibility. Companies could choose to hold them until the 6-month deadline, at which point they would receive the full amount plus interest. Or if they needed money sooner, they could cash them in early, but at a discount. The Reichsbank accepted the bills for early redemption, which gave businesses the confidence that they could convert them to real money if necessary. But there was another clever feature. MEFO bills were made negotiable, meaning that they could be traded between companies. For example, if one company received bills but needed parts from another firm, it could offer to pay with those bills instead of cash. In this way, bills began to circulate like money, even though they were never printed by the government or included in the official money supply. This allowed the Nazi regime to expand the economy and fund large-scale military production without technically increasing its reported debt or printing more banknotes. This financial tool worked so well that it became a silent currency in the background of Germany's economy. Between 1934 and 1938, MEFO bills were used to pay for nearly 12 billion Reichsmarks worth of military contracts. That amount was kept off the official government books, hidden behind the mask of a private company and a collection of IOUs. Companies were willing to play along because they trusted the state's guarantee and because business was booming. With bills in hand, they received government contracts, interest payments, and access to powerful Nazi officials. The entire scheme looked safe and profitable, at least at first. By the end of 1938, the scheme had been running for almost 5 years. At first, it had worked exactly as Schacht had planned. Billions of Reichsmarks worth of rearmament had been paid for using MEFO bills. These paper promises allowed the government to secretly finance a massive military build-up without alarming the public or drawing the attention of other countries. The scheme had helped reduce unemployment, boost industry, and prepare Germany for war, all the while keeping inflation under control and hiding the true scale of the national debt. But the problem with promises is that eventually someone asks to be paid. From the beginning, the bills were supposed to be short-term. Each bill had a 6-month maturity date. However, the government had given itself the right to extend that deadline over and over again, every 90 days. That meant in practice, the bills could stay unpaid for years, and that's exactly what happened. Most bills were simply rolled over and over again. Many companies were willing to wait since the interest was decent and the state's guarantee made them feel secure. But no financial trick lasts forever. By 1938, the very first MEFO bills issued back in 1934 were starting to hit their absolute limit. The Reichsbank had promised it would honour them for 5 years. That time was now running out, and the total amount outstanding was enormous. 12 billion Reichsmarks quietly building up in the background, completely separate from the official national debt. The situation quickly became dangerous. If too many holders of the bills decided to cash them in at once, the German government would be forced to pay billions in real money. But that money did not exist. The Nazi regime had spent far more than it had collected in taxes or borrowed through legal means. The books were full of IOUs, but the vaults were nearly empty. This was the moment when the MEFO scheme started to look like a Ponzi structure. In a Ponzi scheme, new money is used to pay off earlier promises, creating the illusion that everything is working until the new money stops coming. Schacht realized the whole system was now at risk of collapse, and unlike in a real business where failure might mean bankruptcy, a financial collapse in Nazi Germany could mean political chaos, or worse. So Schacht scrambled to keep the scheme going. His first move was to issue new short-term government bonds, hoping that investors would buy them. The idea was to take the money raised from these new loans and use it to pay off bills that were now coming due. But this was exactly the kind of financial trick he had been trying to avoid. It was a classic sign of a Ponzi-style strategy, borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. And with Germany's true financial state still a closely guarded secret, even this wasn't enough. Desperate for more options, Schacht turned to something even darker: confiscated Jewish property. As part of the Nazi regime's racial laws and persecution campaigns, Jewish citizens had already begun to lose their rights, jobs, and businesses. By 1938, the government had introduced a policy known as Aryanization, in which Jewish-owned companies and properties were forcibly sold to approved German citizens, often at prices far below their real value. Now Schacht tried to use some of these seized Jewish assets as collateral to support new loans. In other words, he was using stolen property to try and keep the government from defaulting on its hidden debts. But even this plan was not enough to close the financial gap. The bills kept coming due. The government was still spending heavily on weapons and military expansion. And although war seemed likely, Germany had not yet begun the large-scale looting of foreign treasuries which would come later. Schacht understood that the financial pressure was becoming unbearable. So in early January 1939, he did something risky. Confronted Hitler directly. He went to the Führer and explained the situation clearly. The MEFO scheme was collapsing. The country could no longer afford to spend at this level. The armament program had to slow down. If the government didn't change course, it would face a financial disaster. The Reichsbank, he warned, could not continue to guarantee debts that it had no means of paying. And telling Hitler to stop building weapons? You can guess how that went. Schacht's warning fell on deaf ears. Hitler had no intention of slowing military spending. The Nazi war machine was already in motion, and his plans for conquest were growing more and more ambitious by the day. Hitler didn't want to hear about financial limits. He wanted more tanks, more planes, and more soldiers, no matter the cost. In January 1939, shortly after their meeting, Adolf Hitler dismissed Hjalmar Schacht from his role as president of the Reichsbank. Officially, Schacht was replaced due to disagreements over economic policy, but behind the scenes it was clear that his warnings about government overspending and his refusal to keep printing money for the military had cost him his position. Schacht, one of the key architects of Germany's economic recovery, was now pushed aside. With Schacht gone, the government no longer had a strong internal voice cautioning against reckless financial behaviour. Instead of cutting spending, the Nazi leadership looked for new ways to find cash quickly, and they found it not through economic reform, but through plunder. In March 1939, Germany took control of what remained of Czechoslovakia. This was the first time the Nazis invaded and occupied a non-German-speaking country. As German troops moved in, so did Nazi financial officials. One of their first acts was to seize the reserves of the Czechoslovak National Bank. Nazi agents forced the bank's directors to transfer the country's gold reserve, worth tens of billions of Reichsmarks, to accounts controlled by the Reichsbank in Berlin. This gold was then used to support the Nazi financial system, helping to back new loans and keep the economy afloat. Also helped the regime delay the full impact of the crisis. In effect, the Nazis were now covering their unpaid debts, not with savings or tax revenue, but by looting the wealth of other nations. Later that same year, in September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, launching the Second World War. Alongside the military operation came another financial one. As soon as Polish territory was occupied, Nazi officials seized the Polish state treasury, including its remaining gold, foreign currency, and bank assets. Just like in Czechoslovakia, the goal was to extract as much value as possible from the conquered country to support the needs of the German war economy. These actions delayed the financial collapse that Schacht had predicted, but they didn't solve the underlying problem. The MEFO's scheme officially ended in April 1938, but the effect of its hidden debt still lingered. Billions in unpaid bills had created a financial system based on illusions. Now, with foreign gold flowing in, the Nazis bought themselves a little more time, but at the cost of tying Germany's economy to a path of constant conquest. The financial time bomb remained beneath the surface. As long as the Nazis could keep winning and looting, they could keep the system going. But if the victories stopped, if the conquests failed, the entire economic structure built on hidden liabilities and looted wealth would be at risk of collapse. So now it is clear to you why the MEFO scheme is often called a Nazi Ponzi scheme. It had no real way to repay its debts. It relied on trust, constant rollovers, and eventually looted resources to stay afloat. Do you think modern regimes could be hiding massive military spending the same way Nazi Germany did? Tell us in the comments, subscribe for more Untold History, and we'll see you in the next video.